What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I've got you covered, got a Christmas Day video. Not to brag, I don't think a lot of other MMA channels are going to be supplying you with a fresh video today. And it's going to be a little bit of a longer one, too. This is actually a subscriber requested topic, and it is, if we take all the current UFC champions, all the champions from the male roster, who are their worst matchups throughout all of MMA history? Now, in many cases, it is going to be someone who's currently fighting. It is going to be one of their current contenders. But in some cases, it's going to be a little bit more of a deep dive. So we're going to go through each champion. And we're also going to look at a couple of guys who aren't currently champions, but were champions at the time this video was requested. So, we obviously saw some turnover at the last pay-per-view. Van, technically beat Pantoja, became the champion. And Jan surprised all of us by beating Merab. But when this was requested, Pantoja and Merab were still champs, and so I had already been putting some thought into who their nightmare matchups would be, and so we're also going to address them. We're going to address Van and Pantoja, Jan and Merab, who their nightmare matchups are, and then everyone else. So let's get into it. Starting at Flyweight, Van is a tricky one because he's only fought Royval. He technically fought Pantoja, but we didn't get to see enough of that fight to know anything. And really the only elite guy he's fought is Royval, and yeah, he looked good, and yeah, he won that fight. But he's very young, and he's still largely unproven. Now, he is a boxer, so I am honestly inclined to just go with Pantoja. Now, I'm not saying Pantoja is still in his prime. We'll see. He's already 34, I think. The injury is a bad look. We'll see if he can come back from it. But I feel like a prime Pantoja, the Pantoja that won the belt against Moreno, I feel like that kind of fighter, that sort of durable, tenacious, good cardio, and will fight when he's tired, just aggressive in your face grappler, and not just grappler, but finishing threat, submission threat. I feel like that's the sort of style and the sort of collection of attributes and experience that you want to bring to a younger guy who's basically a boxer and is largely unproven still at the highest level. To me, that seems pretty poisonous to me. And we'll see again, Pantoja might come back and just get his head blown off by Van. But again, I like a prime Pantoja who, still has all his goddamn joints intact and can push the pace and is very durable, because prime Pantoja was extremely durable. I feel like that's going to be hard. And Pantoja's a big dude, makes his grappling work all the better. That's difficult, because you can look at someone like Mighty Mouse. You might be tempted to pick him. He's one of the greatest fighters of all time, one of the most skilled fighters of all time. Surely he could bring a good game plan against someone like Van. And I think he would. If you took prime Mighty Mouse and brought him back, he would know that some combination of kicking, clinching, and grappling and not boxing is the way to beat Van. And he could probably pull that off. But I feel just stylistically, someone like Pantoja is a more directly antagonistic matchup. And he's bigger. Mighty Mouse, and this is also where, spoiler alert, Mighty Mouse is not my pick for the nightmare matchup for Pantoja. But Mighty Mouse was small. Mighty Mouse was basically a straw weight. He never had a size advantage over anybody. Mighty Mouse was to Bantamweight and Flyweight, the two divisions he competed in, kind of what Frankie Edgar was to lightweight and featherweight. Because we know Frankie ultimately got down to Bantamweight. Frankie is basically a Bantamweight who spent almost all of his career in the two divisions above. That's kind of how I look at Demetrius at Flyweight and Bantamweight. So, I would pick a prime Johnson to beat Joshua Van, but I feel if you really wanted to be confident, I would pick Pantoja as his nightmare matchup. And bear in mind, in each of these cases, except for one, in each of these cases where I list each champion's poisonous matchup, in each case I would bet on the challenger. So I think these are pretty poisonous matchups. In each case except for one, I would pick the challenger to dethrone the current champion. So, I think that's interesting, but bear that in mind. So moving on to Pantoja, and even if we took prime Pantoja, what would his worst matchup be? Again, you might be tempted to pick Mighty Mouse, and I'm not saying that Mighty Mouse couldn't beat him, but I think we just know that his actual nightmare matchup is Figueiredo. And the way we know that is because they fought. Like Prime Pantoja fought a Prime Figueiredo and lost. And if you saw my top 20 GOAT list video that I did over the summer, and maybe some spoiler alerts for the revised version of that list that I'm going to be putting out in the next few weeks, but I had Figueiredo as a top 20 fighter, and I did not have Pantoja. And the reason was because Figueiredo beat Pantoja. Figueiredo proved he was the better flyweight of that era. And so again, like to me, that's a no-brainer. Like if you got Pantoja around, all you need is a Prime Figueiredo to also be around, and he's handled. So that's flyweight taken care of. Bantamweight. Peter Yan is a tricky one because on the one hand, you're still tempted to pick Merab as like the toughest guy, especially if there's any question of like Merab's age or whether him fighting 4 times in 1 year affected that outcome at all. Like, does the Merab that say fought Umar or fought Yan the first time, is that still the most difficult fight for Peter Yan? Could be. I think there are some other contenders in the division who might be. Like, you know, we could look at his losses. Like, I don't think Aljamain Sterling, even though he beat him in the rematch, and I think that was fair. I think he won the first 3 rounds. But even there, like, I still felt like I left that pair of fights thinking Peter Yan was the better fighter. And if they had a trilogy fight at some point, I would pick Yan, you know? So it's like, you know, I don't think he's the right pick. O'Malley is around, and that's interesting because Peter Yan seems to, like, it seemed like what made O'Malley so difficult was not only the range and the speed and everything, but it seemed like it was finally an opponent who, if he had to, Yan couldn't just reliably beat in a slugfest. Because Yan has won rounds and even won fights that way, like think of like Jimmy Rivera, where he's actually been getting outpointed a little bit, and then he finds some way to kind of sit down in the pocket and actually throw some heat at the guy and hurt him. And against a guy like O'Malley, like, that's just not reliable. Like, O'Malley, if anything, had an even better ability to hurt Yan. And Yan still arguably won that fight. He still arguably won that fight. And he used his wrestling a lot as the fight went on. And I think in a rematch, he will use his wrestling all the more and really kind of wear O'Malley down. So I think I would favor him in the rematch, which makes me like not inclined to pick O'Malley as the obvious poisonous matchup. Umar is interesting, but I think, like, I don't know if he's enough of a finishing threat on the ground. I don't know if his grappling is actually good enough to like thwart Yan, especially after what we saw in the Merab rematch. And I don't think Umar is that good on the feet. So like, I don't think he's that tough of a matchup. I mean, I would still only narrowly be picking Yan to beat him, but like, I think that's a close fight. But as far as like a poisonous matchup, he doesn't impress me. And really the person who stands out the most from history, I think, is TJ Dillashaw, honestly. I think a Prime Dillashaw with, you know, a Dwayne Ludwig coached Dillashaw at the height of his striking prowess, you know, who is a great wrestler, a great shoot fighter, you know, uses takedowns to set up his strikes. I think that kind of guy who's mixing in the takedowns and who has such a schooled like approach on the feet, like, I'd be really interested to see how Dillashaw, with his switch ups, his stance switches, with his head kicks, etc., I'm really curious to see how he tried to pick apart Peter Yan's high guard, how he tried to pick apart Yan's defenses. So, and I think Dillashaw is just historically underrated. I think people hate on him because of the snake in the grass shit, and they hate on him because of the EPO, but I think he's profoundly underrated. I think as far as like who passes the eye test, I think Prime Dillashaw is one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. And I think I'm going to pick him. Like, I think, like, I'd be tempted to pick Merab as, you know, the toughest fight, but I think I'm going to go with the sort of dark horse of Dillashaw. But again, this is the one scenario where I don't actually think I would pick the challenger to win. I think even there, I would pick Dillashaw to beat Peter Yan. And what I'm ultimately saying is, I'm not sure there's a bantamweight that I would, in all of history, that I would pick to beat Peter Yan currently, which is a pretty good turnaround for Yan, considering that we were all counting him out against Merab just a few weeks ago. But with Merab, Obviously, now we know Peter Yan is his poisonous matchup. But prior to the Yan fight, what would I have said? Like, because again, we were all assuming this was going to be an easy win for Merab. Had Merab won, like, what would my answer be? And I think I would go with like Dillashaw is tempting. Like Dillashaw is tempting again. But I might honestly go with like a prime Jose Aldo. Now, if you recall, prior to Merab losing, I was making the case that I would pick him over everybody. Like that there's not a single person in all of MMA history whom I would pick to like beat Merab in a pound for pound sense, meaning if you scaled them to the same size and made them fight, like does anyone have the formula to beat him? I was saying no. I was saying he'd beat GSP, he'd beat John Jones, he'd beat Khabib. Like I was making that argument. And I still largely stand by it. The Yan loss, notwithstanding, but like that didn't suddenly reverse all my thoughts on Merab. I still think he has the makeup to beat just about everyone else. But Jose Aldo is an interesting one because he fought an old Aldo and still barely beat him. And he couldn't take him down once. And don't get me wrong, that was only 3 rounds. If it went for 2 more, I think we would see Aldo wilt and we would see that fight start snowballing a bit more. But as it stood, it was a close fight. Not much happened. And not a lot of great offense was laid out by Merab. And it really makes you wonder how like prime Aldo, like title run Aldo, like a 24-year-old Jose Aldo, how he would do against Merab. Because that guy just fucking lived to kill wrestlers. Okay, like that guy, you watch even though later in the title run, like his first fight with Chad Mendes, where, and granted, Aldo cheated, he grabbed the fence a bit to stop a takedown, but he still got taken down after that. He was just overall doing well to stop the takedowns and then get back to his feet. And as soon as he got some separation, boom, turns, lands the knee and knocks him out in one blow. Like his ability to do that for the first like 2 or 3 rounds against Merab would be pretty fucking dangerous. Like I wouldn't be shocked if prime Aldo could just finish Merab early. Even there though, even prime Aldo did wilt as fights went on sometimes, like just look at the Mark Hominick fight. So I think I'd still favor Merab. But to me, that's the most interesting. I think that's even more interesting than like Dillashaw versus Merab. So again, Peter Yan, I'm not sure I'd pick anyone to beat him. But if I had to pick someone to be the worst matchup, I think I'd go with Dillashaw. And with Merab, obviously we now know it's Peter Yan. But aside from Yan, who's the most dangerous for Merab, I think it would be a prime Aldo down at Bantamweight. So that's that. Moving on. Featherweight, Volkanovski. I think we know it's Ilya. It's Ilya Topuria. I think Volk was past his best when Ilya beat him, but I think even prime Volk had the same vulnerabilities. Prime Volk was still a little chinny. Prime Volk would still jab in and exit with his chin up. And I didn't see anything in terms of his movement or just his overall skill to suggest that those things had diminished in the fight with Ilya. Meaning, I think Ilya's ability to eventually corner him, eventually cut him off, and eventually get him past the black lines, up against the fence, and eventually land those knockout blows, I think that would be there against the Volk that beat Max the 3rd time. Like, I don't think that was a problem of age so much. Again, it's still a kind of old Volk that he ultimately beat, and that still hurts Ilya's resume a little bit because, I can only speculate that he would have beaten a prime Volk. I don't know for sure, but I think he would. I think it would be basically the same fight. Another sneaky one is prime Conor McGregor at featherweight, because at featherweight, McGregor never lost in the UFC. His size, his range, this is when he was, he had more of that karate versus boxing style. This is before he'd let all the drugs and money and everything go to his head. Like, that guy was dangerous. And that guy, I could easily see catching Volk early. And Volk, conversely, wouldn't finish him early. Now, Volk is a great game planner. He might use the low kicks. He might use his wrestling. He might do things to fatigue Conor, and we never really saw that at featherweight, aside from the Chad Mendes fight, and there Conor came in with an injury, and it was like a late notice replacement, so he wasn't expecting to fight a wrestler, so he can't hold it against him as much. But knowing how he fatigued at lightweight, or rather at 170, when he fought Diaz both times, you'd expect something similar would happen if he made it to round 3 against Volk. So I'm not 100% sure who I'd pick in that one, but I could really see, even though Volk all time is better than McGregor and Volk at featherweight all time is better than McGregor, I could see that being a very hard one. But the most poisonous, I think, is pretty clearly just Ilya. And speaking of Ilya, moving up to lightweight, who's his worst matchup? You've got a few options that are tempting, and they're all grapplers. It's not Charles, and it's none of the historic guys like Edgar and BJ Penn and Ben Henderson and RDA and those guys. Anthony Pettis. It's not those guys. It's basically two current guys in Arman and Islam, if he's at lightweight, and it's Khabib. And of the three of those, I think Arman's the easiest fight. I think I might actually pick Ilya to beat Arman because, yes, Arman is showing improvements as far as his finishing ability on the ground. His ground and pound has always been great. His submissions appear to be coming along. His game is coming together a little more coherently, I think. But I'm not convinced that Ilya can't stay off the grappling long enough to just knock his ass out. And I think Arman's hittable on the feet. I think he's shorter. He'll be more in range. I think Arman's he can box a bit. Yeah, his kicks are really, pretty and flexible. But his game on the feet, it reminds me a little bit of Umar down at Bantamweight, where it's I see some good moves. I see some flashy shit. I see some stuff to show that you're well schooled, but I just don't see a good game that's well put together on the feet. And that's going to reliably lead to you hurting people. And yeah, I feel like Ilya would hurt him pretty quick, to be honest. And I just think he could do enough to avoid the grappling long enough to achieve that. So I think I would pick Ilya to beat Arman. And Arman is, of course, his toughest fight currently at lightweight and should be the top contender, but is officially the top contender, but just isn't getting his shot, and that's bullshit. But nevertheless, I would pick Ilya to win. With Khabib and Islam, though, I think I'd pick both of them to beat Ilya. Especially because Ilya is small. Khabib, a giant lightweight. Islam, a giant lightweight, now a welterweight. Khabib, a sloppy striker. He could be effective. We, of course, know he dropped Conor, and he dropped other people with that, weird, almost bad karate, top of the knuckle uppercut that he would throw. It was effective, He was very fast. People underrate how fast he was. They think of him as being very strong, but, I think he was faster than he was strong. And he was hard to hit. He just, he moved a lot. He maintained distance. He stayed out of range until he wanted to be, in your face. And he made that work. It was a more defensively reliable version of kind of what Merab does. And, people brag about this, but it's true. Khabib went 13-0 in the UFC and never got cut, never got dropped. Barely even 8 clean punches. You can think on one hand how, Conor caught him a little bit. Dustin caught him at one point. Michael Johnson caught him at one point. But, I've never even seen him, wobbled. I've never seen him do the Bambi legs. And, that speaks to something. And he was a good game planner. I see MMHA shitting on him and saying Charles would easily beat him because he got caught in a guillotine, a shitty guillotine by Poirier. And he had to do all this stuff to get out of it. And it's yeah, you would just game plan for Charles's guillotine, buddy. Just like a game plan for how to take down Justin, using a double leg sequence that he normally never uses. That camp game plans well. They'd be ready for stuff from Charles that they weren't worried about from Poirier. And that didn't even matter when Poirier did it anyway. So it's, I think same thing with Ilya. I think he'd know the assignment. Sorry about that. The memory card was full. So we're doing this in two takes. But yeah, he would just know the assignment. He would know what he had to do. And Ilya is very small. And I'm not convinced he could, while I'm, somewhat confident he can survive the grappling enough to fuck up Arman, I'm just not convinced he can do that against Khabib. And with Islam, I think it's all the worse because Islam is, of the three, Arman, himself, and Khabib, he is the best striker. He is the best in the clinch. He is equally defensively, troubling to, land a good glove on as Khabib was. And he is as threatening on the ground as Khabib was. So I think Islam is the hardest matchup. I think Islam at welterweight is a bridge too far for Ilya. And even at lightweight, I would still pick Islam. So I'd like to see that fight. I'd like to see it even at welterweight, but I'm not picking Ilya to win. So Islam's his toughest fight. And speaking of him, moving up to welterweight, For Islam, there's a few options, a couple of which are current and a couple of which are historical. So currently, you've got Shavkat, who I think is by far his toughest challenge as far as his current crop of contenders. The size, the wrestling, and Shavkat's wrestling isn't as good as people thought it was, but it's still good enough that it's going to be difficult for Islam to do to him what he did to, say, JDM. On the ground and on the feet, Shavkat is just a very dangerous finishing threat. If you look at his win record, I think he has an even 50-50 split between TKO finishes and submission finishes. Granted, some of those TKO finishes are like from ground and pound and not from the feet, but nevertheless, dangerous on the feet in all phases. He's got dangerous kicks, he's got dangerous punches, he's dangerous in the clinch, very dangerous and underrated ground and pound. He can submit you, like he'll be bigger, he'll be stronger, it'll be tiring to wrestle with him. And not that his cardio is perfect either, but like it's more exhausting to wrestle the bigger man, especially if he can actually fucking wrestle. And so that's a rough one. Like that's a hard fight for Islam. Gary, it would be tricky in his own ways, but I think of the current crop of contenders, I think even Morales is like an interesting matchup. He's kind of the classic sprawl and brawler. But I think of the current crop, Shavkat's the hardest. Then you've got Chimaev, because what about Chimaev at welterweight? Also a tough fight. I would definitely pick Chimaev at middleweight, but if he had to cut to welterweight, where he's going to be a little smaller, he's probably going to exhaust more quickly. That'd be more interesting. I think I'd still lean towards Chimaev, but and I very heavily lean towards him at middleweight. I made a whole video about it, but at welterweight, it's a little trickier. But he's an option. Prime Usman is an option, because Prime Usman, very strong grappler, very great conditioning, big dude, not just strong grappler in terms of his ability, but strong in terms of his physicality. Like I forget who it was, but I heard someone who like trained with him describe him as having quote unquote freaky Martian android strength. And he fucking seemed like it back in the day. And just look at how well he did against Chimaev as an old man up a weight class and on short notice. Just like look at how he survived versus how like Robert Whittaker did. You know what I mean? So Usman would be tough, but I think Usman is beatable in the sense that on the feet, Usman could take a punch reasonably well. And he got better on the feet. He got better working his jab and whatnot. And he could always push a pace. But I think on the feet, Usman was always awkward. It was always plodding. It was always a little stiff. And he is hittable. And I think Islam's game plan for a prime Usman would be to just keep it on the feet and like outland him. And I think he could probably do that. So I think I would lean Islam against Usman. But there's two even more historic deep cuts that I think are interesting. One of which is GSP, for obvious reasons. One, arguably the greatest fighter of all time. Insanely well-rounded, great wrestling, great game planner. And just, I haven't heard him talk about Islam specifically, but I've heard him talk about Khabib. And kind of lightly, he said like, well, I'd have to actually watch more tape and develop a true game plan if I were going to actually fight that guy. But he spoke loosely about what he would need to do, and he had all the right ideas. So it's like, I think him and his team could put together a very good game plan, even for someone as comprehensively challenging as Islam is. But another underrated option would be prime Johnny Hendricks. The Johnny Hendricks, pre-USADA, roided up Johnny Hendricks. And before anyone complains, just watch any video where I talked about Islam obviously being on stuff. But anyways, Johnny Hendricks, when he fought GSP, when he fought Robbie Lawler, like that guy, big, powerful wrestler, athletic, strong, great knockout threat. That'd be a tough one for someone like Islam, as the smaller guy moving up. Now, Hendricks, there's some caveats there. Hendricks wasn't as big as he seemed because he was kind of a fat guy, but Hendricks also was a southpaw, and he really relied on that powerful, rear side left hand to knock dudes out. And against a fellow southpaw in Islam, that won't be there as readily. So there might be an easier path to just like outstrike him, and then, maybe try to get him tired a little, work the body, work the legs, use your grappling later on. Like, I think I would pick Islam to beat prime Johnny Hendricks. I'm just saying prime Johnny Hendricks is like an underrated option as someone who would give him some trouble. So it mostly comes down to GSP Khamzat, and Shavkat. And of the three of them, I think I'm going to pick Shavkat actually as the toughest matchup because he's more proven at welterweight as far as like reliably making the weight and fighting than is Chimaev. And he's much bigger than GSP, who was basically a lightweight. And he's the more well-rounded finishing threat of the three of them. There just wouldn't be an area where Islam could like reliably avoid damage or like a finishing threat. So I think it's honestly him, and that's why I'd love to see that fight. I hope Shavkat can heal up and kind of get his shit together and get his goddamn title shot. I'd rather see that than Gary get it. And I want to see Islam defend his belt against at least one of them to really cement himself as the GOAT. But, I do think, honestly, his toughest fight is right there in his own division, in Shavkat. So, moving up to middleweight with Chimaev, some people might think that he's unstoppable at middleweight. And I think looking at his current crop of contenders, he may be. But I think there is a guy from the past who would probably beat him. And it's Prime Yoel Romero. Okay? Prime Yoel Romero. So we're saying maybe Machida fight-ish kind of in Yoel's career. Because he was like Daniel Cormier. He was always kind of old, but his athleticism was more apparent. And, so you're trying to find the sweet spot of where his athleticism was still there, his endurance was still there enough, and where his techniques were kind of coming together. And I think that's right around the Machida fight. I think that guy would be pretty nightmarish for Chimaev. I think if you look at, if you just look at first time ever, we've got 3 cuts. Something just interrupted the video. Anyways, so if you take Prime Romero, Machida era against Chimaev, Romero has he's kind of like Cejudo. He never quite brought his wrestling in as much as you would like from someone with his accolades because he was a silver medalist at the Olympics, was Romero. But he would just need it defensively. He would just need to not get taken down and then just beat the shit out of Chimaev. And, and Romero has shown flaws even there. He has gotten taken down in fights by guys who aren't as good of wrestlers as him. But I think part of that is just because he wasn't worried. Whereas if he was fighting Chimaev, he would just treat it like a wrestling camp. Because even Chimaev is kind of doing that now. You look at the training footage where he's now training with the Russian wrestling team. He seems to be doing just full-on wrestling practices with them. Versus earlier in his career where he's going out to Thailand and he's training in Sweden and the MMA gym that Alexander Gustafsson trains at. He seemed to be doing more MMA type shit for his training camps, whereas now he seems to be doubling down on his wrestling, and just full-on wrestling practice seems to be some huge chunk of his training now. I'm sure he's still boxing and stuff, but it seems like a big chunk of it, more so than in the past, is his wrestling. I think Romero would just do the same thing because he would just see how that guy fights and he'd be like, yeah, I just need to make sure my wrestling's on point. I'll just mostly do wrestling in my camp and I'll keep it on the feet. He's not going to be able to take me down. I'm going to fuck him up because on the feet, Khamzat's just very hittable and he's durable, but he's not the most durable. I mean, we even just saw in the Dricus fight, the few moments Dricus had time to work on the feet, he got shit done and he was able to kind of hurt him. Yoel Romero was insanely dangerous, And very durable, too. So, of the two of them, I think if they get into a firefight, I trust Romero a lot more. If one of them kind of catches the other off guard, I trust Romero a lot more. And yeah, he's just bigger, stronger, and the more accomplished wrestler, and he just needs to nullify the other guy's fucking wrestling. So I think that's just, again, a nightmarish situation for Khamzat, is to get, prime Romero with a training camp, dialed in. Against Khamzat, I think that would be a bridge too far. So I'm picking Romero for that one. Light heavyweight, maybe the easiest one to call. Alex Pereira is getting dog walked by Prime John Jones. It just is what it is. Prime Jones, insanely durable, insane conditioning, knew how to game plan. He would know the assignment. He would know that he needs to wrestle. His wrestling in his prime was elite. His finishing ability on the ground, whether it was from ground and pound or submissions, was fantastic. And he would just know what to do. Because some people gave him this false reputation of beating people where they're great. And it's because it's oh, he wrestled with Chael Sonnen, who was way smaller than him. Or, oh my God, he He stood on the feet with Glover Teixeira, who was kind of earning like a knockout threat reputation at the time because he knocked out dudes like Ryan Bader. But it was like, it's not like he stood in the pocket with Glover. He got him up against the fence and like worked him with elbows and shit in like clinching range. Like that's not the same thing. Like that's basically what Kane did to Junior Dos Santos. That's not the same thing as just standing out in the middle and like swapping right hands with the guy, you know. So John always knew how to deal with matchups when he thought guys were dangerous. And he would just look at Alex and know what to do. He'd be like, eh. And yeah, Alex has underrated wrestling and takedown defense and everything, but it's not going to be good enough. Like I guarantee you Prime Jones, who out-wrestled Daniel Cormier in their fight, for Christ's sake, in their first fight, like he's just going to come out and keep distance until he shoots and clinches or whatever, and he's going to just work over Alex. It's going to be pretty easy. So that's that done. Lastly, at heavyweight, Tom Aspinall. Now, the thumbnail, if you notice, there's a question mark, okay? I don't actually think Fedor can beat Tom. Fedor is too small. Fedor is the size of Robert Whittaker. And more on that later because I plan on doing a video over this big hiatus we have before the next UFC numbered event. I plan on doing a video about weight cutting and about like how much fighters can cut and about how much historical fighters from the past, from like the 2000s, like just how small they were relative to the divisions they actually fought in. Fedor is an example. Like Fedor is a middleweight. Fedor could maybe make welterweight, you know, and so more on that later. But Fedor, so small. Like Fedor, one of the greatest fighters of all time, a very well-rounded fighter, but against someone like Tom Aspinall, it's a bridge too far. Like, especially Tom being well-rounded, being a good grappler, being so fast, like maybe Fedor could catch him, but I wouldn't rely on it. I think Tom would catch him, and I think Tom would out-grapple him. I think Tom would just... It wouldn't be that hard. I think Tom would comfortably win that one. We have a current guy in Francis Ngannou. I mean, Cyril Gane did okay in round one. I'm more interested in the rematch than I was in the first fight. But I'm still picking Tom. I think of the current guys, Francis is the more interesting matchup. Francis is the bigger threat. You know, his wrestling has come along. The size, the strength, the knockout power, the durability. I mean, maybe that's diminished now that Joshua gave him the smashing that he did, but like, historically, Francis has been very durable. Like, that's always been an interesting fight. But I think, honestly, his toughest fight is someone from the past, and that is Prime Junior Dos Santos. Because Prime Junior Dos Santos, good gas tank, insane chin, great takedown defense, you know, and he had to prove it against guys like Shane Carwin. Great takedown defense. On the ground, he was a black belt under Nogueira, and I don't think he's ever been submitted. I'd have to check. Maybe his like very first loss ever, because he kind of like Tom. He had like Tom had 2 early losses, but one of which I think was a DQ, and one of which was a submission. But like Jose Aldo lost like one of his first fights. You know, this happens to many of the greats. They like lose one fight very early and then just go on a run. Like something like that happened to Junior. It might have been a submission. I can't remember, but during his UFC run, I don't think he ever got submitted. I think like maybe there's like some recent one when he was super washed that's escaping my memory, but on the whole, I don't think he ever got submitted. And there's a reason why. Again, his fucking takedown defense was immaculate, and he was a black belt. Like, he would be tough to grapple with. He'd be tough to put away on the feet because, again, Prime Dos Santos had just an iron chin. You know, he had conditioning. It wasn't like Cain Velasquez conditioning, but it was more fucking proven than like Tom's is right now. And he was a dangerous boxer. You know, he was limited in some ways as a boxer, but in terms of just having good hands, fast hands, and being able to knock your ass out, and not just knock you out, but knock you out with like virtually any punch. You know, he'd knock you out with a cross, an overhand, an uppercut, a hook. Like he was dangerous with anything he fucking hit you with. That was a power punch. And he had good reach. He was tall. He was like 6'4", so he'd have like size parity with Tom. Like, that just seems really hard. You know, it's like that seems like one where Tom's typical game of like in-out 1-2 boxing and like maybe trying to set up the grappling, that just sounds like a nightmare. Because again, I don't think the grappling's going to work. And I think playing that striking game with Junior just seems like a good way to get knocked the fuck out. And Tom, I think of the two, it's like we've seen Tom get knocked out, but I think of the two, he's appeared much chinnier. And I'd probably wager Junior actually hit harder. So it's like that just seems rough, man. Like that, because sure you could pick other guys like, well, how would Cain Velasquez do? How would Stipe do? And those would be really interesting fights too. But I think there's more obvious paths to victory. It reminds me of like when I said like Mighty Mouse versus Pantoja, or excuse me, versus Van versus like Pantoja versus Van, where it's like these other guys are also great and they bring very comprehensive skills to and attributes to the equation that could be leveraged to win. But as far as just like perfectly matching up in that like rock, paper, scissors way, or that, grass, water, fire, Pokemon type kind of way, I feel like Junior is just like all the worst things against someone like Tom. I think he would be the hardest matchup in history. So that's all I got in summary. Pantoja beats Van. Figgy beats Pantoja. Probably no one beats Jan, but I would pick Dillashaw. Jan beats Merab, and after him, Prime Jose is your best bet. Ilya beats Volk, and Connor could probably do it too. Islam and Khabib probably beat Ilya. Shavkat's probably your best bet against Islam, with Chimaev and GSP and a distant fourth place Johnny Hendricks being other good options. Prime Yol beats Chimaev for sure. John Jones smashes Alex, and Junior is your best bet against Tom. And Francis and to lesser degrees guys like Gon and Stipe and Kane are like good shouts too. But Junior's your man. So that's what I got. Merry fucking Christmas. Take care.